The great hall of Ironvale Castle had never smelled so much of hope. Lottie noticed it the moment she crossed the threshold. The thick perfume of burning resin mingling with pine branches hung above the archways. Beeswax candles lining every stone ledge, their light casting warm gold across the banners of the 7 packs that had traveled days to be present that night. The Feast of the Binding Moon came only once every decade, when the Alpha King renewed the bonds of allegiance with his vassal packs beneath the full moon's witness. It was the most sacred gathering in the kingdom of Veldrath, and she had been invited. No, she corrected herself quietly. She had been promised a place at the high table. Edmund had told her himself, 3 moons past. Wear something worthy of the occasion, Lottie. You'll stand beside me when I receive the king's blessing. She had taken those words and built a small world around them. The dress had taken her 6 weeks to finish. Deep green wool, the finest she could afford after months of setting aside what little coin her work at the healing house earned her. She had embroidered the hem herself, silver thread following the pattern of the Ashfin Pack sigil, a running wolf mid-leap, which was Edmund's family crest, and, she had believed, soon to be hers as well. Her older sister Marin had helped her pin the bodice and had cried a little, declaring she looked like a noblewoman. Lottie had laughed and said she simply looked like a woman trying very hard. Marin had told her there was no difference. She wore her blonde hair loose except for a single braid that fell over her left shoulder, the braid of an unmated female, as was custom. She carried no jewels. She needed none. The dress was enough. The promise was enough. The hall was already full when she arrived. Long tables stretched the length of the room, laden with roasted boar, herb bread, honeyed root vegetables, and pitchers of dark wine. Warriors in leather and fur occupied the benches alongside pack nobles dressed in silk and embroidered wool. At the far end, beneath the banner of the Iron Wolf, Veldrath's royal sigil, sat the high table, elevated on a stone dais. Lottie searched for Edmund. She found him immediately, because he was easy to find. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in a room. He stood near the high table, already laughing at something a nobleman beside him had said, goblet in hand, completely at ease. She moved toward him through the crowd. She was perhaps 10 steps away when he turned and saw her. She watched his expression. She had learned to read Edmund the way a curandera reads weather. Quickly, carefully, and with the understanding that what she saw might not be what she wished to see. For a fraction of a breath, his face opened. Then something behind his eyes shifted, and he looked past her shoulder. She stopped walking. "Edmund," she said, keeping her voice steady. He came to her, but slowly, not the stride of a man pleased to see her, but the careful approach of one managing an inconvenience. He lowered his voice when he reached her. "Lottie." A pause. "You came." "You asked me to come," she replied simply. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. His jaw worked briefly before he spoke again. "There has been a change. My mother." He stopped, began again. "The circumstances of the evening have required certain adjustments." The silver wolf at her hem felt suddenly very heavy. "Adjustments," she repeated. "Lady Seraphine of the Coldvale Pack will be seated beside me tonight." He said the name the way people say names they have rehearsed, carefully, without emotion. "Her father is Alpha Doran. The alliance between Ashfin and Coldvale would strengthen both packs considerably. You understand how these things work." Lottie understood exactly how these things worked. She had grown up watching them work precisely like this. "And the promise you made?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. She would not raise it. Not here. Not with 200 wolves within hearing distance of a woman who had no pack, no title, and no leverage. Edmund's jaw tightened. "Lottie, you are a healer's assistant from the lower quarter. Seraphine is the daughter of an alpha. I should not have let things between us go as far as they did. That was my failing, and I acknowledge it." He looked briefly as though he believed this made it better. "You are a kind woman. You will find someone appropriate." She stood very still for a long moment. She thought about the 6 weeks of candlelight sewing. She thought about Maren crying. She thought about every quiet evening Edmund had spent at her table, eating the food she cooked, taking the warmth she offered as freely as a man drinks from a stream he has no intention of claiming. She thought about the silver wolf stitched at her hem. "Of course," she said. She turned and walked away from him. She did not run. She would not give the room that. She moved through the crowd with her chin level and her hands still, excusing herself around bodies, navigating toward the great arched doors at the side of the hall that opened to the corridor beyond. She would find her cloak, collect herself in the quiet of the stone passage, and then she would go home. She was almost to the arch when the crowd shifted around her, not away from her, but toward something else, a new arrival. The hum of conversation dropped, and then swelled again, differently, lower and more charged. She felt it before she understood it, the way wolves sense a change in the wind. 3 men had entered through the main doors at the far end of the hall. She knew who they were before she had fully turned to look. The room told her with every held breath, every straightened spine, every cup lowered slowly to a table. The guards along the walls had gone rigid. Even Alpha Doran, seated at the high table, rose to his feet. The Alpha King of Veldrath had arrived unannounced. Caius Draveth walked the way power walks when it has nothing to prove, without hurry, without performance, with the particular stillness of a man who knows that every room he enters has already rearranged itself around him before he reaches the center. He was taller than most men present, broad through the chest and shoulders, dressed in black leather armor, crossed with dark brown straps, and a manto of black fur that settled across his shoulders like a mantle of smoke. His hair was dark, worn in long braids that fell past his shoulders, threaded with something that caught the torchlight. Iron, perhaps, or polished obsidian. A thin scar ran along the left side of his jaw, pale against his dark beard. His eyes, when the torchlight touched them, were the precise blue of deep ice, cold and absolutely clear. He had 2 men with him. One walked at his right, lean, quick-eyed, dark gold stubble along his jaw, and a manner that suggested he found the entire gathering faintly amusing. The other was quieter, broader, with the patient stillness of a mountain, wearing the markings of the king's personal guard on his shoulder plate. Lottie pressed herself toward the arch to make way, as everyone near the path to the dais was doing. She was perhaps 4 steps from the corridor door, when someone behind her moved suddenly, and she was jostled forward. Not badly, not enough to fall, but enough that she stumbled into the narrow space between the moving crowd and a stone pillar, and her foot caught the edge of a bench. She caught herself against the pillar with one hand. She straightened, breathing quietly, willing herself invisible. She was not invisible. The king's strange ice-blue eyes had tracked across the room with the automatic precision of a predator cataloging his territory, and they had stopped on her. Not on the crowd. Not on the dais where the pack alphas were arranging themselves to receive him. On her, specifically, pressed against a pillar in a green wool dress with silver thread at the hem, blonde braid over one shoulder, cheeks warm with the particular heat of humiliation recently survived. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. She did not look away, because looking away would have required her to think clearly, and thinking clearly seemed temporarily beyond her. Then his companion, the amused one, leaned slightly toward the king's ear and said something she could not hear. The king did not respond. He simply continued toward the dais, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed, almost imperceptibly, like a man who has registered a scent he intends to find again. Lottie released the breath she had been holding. She turned and stepped through the arch into the corridor, and the heavy door swung shut behind her, muffling the noise of the hall to a low murmur of stone and fire. She stood alone in the dim passage and pressed the back of her hand to her cheek. The silver wolf at her hem did not feel so heavy now. It felt, very strangely, like the beginning of something she had no name for yet. The corridor was cold, in the way that stone corridors always are, indifferent, permanent, unimpressed by the troubles of those who pass through them. Lottie stood alone for a long moment, letting the chill settle against her warm face, and when she felt steady enough, she retrieved her gray wool cloak from the peg near the side entrance, where she had left it, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She had known, somewhere beneath the hope she had allowed herself, that the evening might end this way. Lottie was not a woman given to illusions. She had grown up in the lower quarter of Veldrath's capital, the daughter of a herbalist who had died before naming her children to any pack. No pack mark meant no protection, no inheritance, no standing in the hierarchy of wolves that governed every aspect of life in the kingdom. She had built what she had through the healing house. Years of learning poultices and tisanes, bone setting and fever management, the careful language of bodies that were broken and needed mending. It was honest work, important work. But it did not make her equal to Lady Seraphine of Coldvale, and Edmund had always known that. She had simply chosen not to know it alongside him. She pushed through the side door into the castle's inner courtyard. The night air was sharp with the smell of pine and wood smoke, and somewhere below, the river that ran beneath Ironvale's eastern wall. The moon was enormous, the binding moon, full and pale silver, washing the courtyard stones white. Above the great hall, she could hear the muffled rise of voices as the gathering resumed its formalities. She crossed the courtyard toward the outer gate, where the guards would let her through without question. She was nobody. Nobody required no explanation. She was halfway across when she heard the door behind her open. She did not look back. Servants moved through this courtyard regularly. It was nothing. "The embroidery on that hem," said a voice, "is the Ashvin sigil." She stopped. The voice was low and unhurried, with the quality of someone who was not accustomed to raising it to be heard. She turned slowly. The king's companion, the amused one, with the dark gold stubble and the quick eyes, stood in the doorway, arms folded loosely, studying her with the expression of a man solving a mild puzzle entirely for his own entertainment. He had the lean build of a seasoned fighter, and the easy posture of someone who spent a great deal of time in proximity to power without being intimidated by it. "And yet," he continued, "you are leaving without having sat at the Ashvin table. I find that interesting." "What I find interesting," Lottie said quietly, "is that the king's man has time to follow strangers across courtyards." He smiled. It was a quick smile, genuinely pleased rather than polished. "Rael," he said, touching his chest briefly, "second to the king, and you are—" "Someone who is going home," she replied. "Lottie." The new voice came from the doorway behind Rael. Every nerve she had went still. Caius Draveth stepped into the courtyard. He was not wearing the fur manto now. He had left it inside, and without it he was somehow more imposing rather than less. The breadth of his shoulders and the controlled way he moved more visible without the layering. The moonlight caught the ice blue of his eyes and the pale line of the scar along his jaw. He stopped beside Rael and looked at her with the same direct, unhurried attention he had given her in the hall. "How do you know my name?" she asked. She was proud of how steady she sounded. "I asked," he said simply. Rael made a small sound that might have been suppressed amusement. The king did not look at him. "You asked someone my name," Lottie said carefully. "Why?" Caius was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of an answer to give. He descended the 2 steps from the doorway into the courtyard and walked toward her. Not quickly, not with any urgency, just the steady and inevitable approach of a man who moves toward things he has decided to move toward. He stopped at a respectful distance, close enough that she could see the detail of the iron clasps on his armor, far enough that nothing about his posture pressed or crowded. "Your scent reached me before I reached the dais," he said. "That does not happen often." Lottie blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not among them. In the hierarchy of wolven society, a wolf's scent was deeply personal, the truest marker of identity, bloodline, and status that existed. For a king to mention it to a stranger was not ordinary conversation. She did not know what it was, precisely, but it was not ordinary. "I am not a member of any pack," she said. "My scent should be unremarkable." "It is not," he said. There was no particular emphasis in it. He stated it the way he might state any observed fact, with the flatness of someone who does not feel the need to ornament truth. Rael had drifted slightly to the side, giving them space while remaining present, and now the third man, the quiet, massive one from the hall, appeared in the doorway as well, taking up position there with the silent competence of someone whose entire professional identity was remaining in doorways. "You were leaving," Caius said. It was not a question. He had seen her trajectory across the courtyard. "Yes." "Because of Edmund Ashfin." She held his gaze. "You gathered a great deal of information in a short time, my lord." "I gathered very little. What I observed told me the rest." He tilted his head slightly, something measuring in his expression. "He is a fool." She said nothing. "That is not flattery," the king said, as if he had read the slight tension that moved across her face. "I do not flatter. I am telling you what I observed. A man who made a public promise to a woman and broke it in the same hall where he expected to receive the blessing of his king. That is not strategy. That is cowardice with noble clothing." The words landed somewhere precise and deep, in the place where Lottie had been carefully not thinking about Edmund since she had walked away from him. She felt her composure waver slightly, and steadied it with the long practice of someone who had learned early that falling apart was a luxury the Packless could not afford. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Caius considered the question with evident seriousness. "Because you walked away from that hall without making a scene, without weeping in public, without demanding what you were owed. You simply left." A pause. "I wanted to see if you would do the same here." "And if I did? Then I would have let you go," he said, "but you turned around." She had turned around because he had spoken. She was not certain what to make of that. In the silence that followed, Rael stepped forward with the energy of a man who has been patient long enough. "What my king means to say, and will take considerably longer to say, left to his own pace, is that there will be a formal presentation of the king's household at the Winter Court, 6 weeks hence. Healers and skilled practitioners are always welcomed into royal service. If you are the woman I believe you to be, which is to say a woman with no pack affiliation and considerable professional skill, that invitation is available to you." Lottie looked at Rael, then back at Caius. "You are offering me a position at court," she said slowly. "On the basis of assent and the manner in which I left a banquet." "On the basis of what I observed," Caius said, "which is sometimes more than men learn about others in years." The binding moon sat heavy and silver over the courtyard. Somewhere in the hall behind them, she could hear the beginning of the formal proceedings, voices rising in the ritual cadences of pack allegiance, the low roll of drums that marked the ceremony's opening. Edmund would be standing at his place by now. Lady Seraphine would be beside him. The silver wolf at Lottie's hem would mean nothing to anyone in that room. And here in this courtyard, the King of Veldrath was watching her with ice-blue eyes, and waiting, without pressure, for her to think. She thought. She thought about the healing house, where she had spent 4 years learning to mend what was broken. She thought about Marin, who had pinned this dress and cried a little, and believed in a future Lottie had almost believed in herself. She thought about what it meant to be packless in a kingdom built on pack. The small daily diminishments, the closed doors, the way people's eyes moved past her in rooms like the one she had just left. She thought about the particular quality of a gaze that did not move past her. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, Caius confirmed. And this invitation, it carries no obligation beyond service? Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than a smile, and more permanent. You may leave royal service at any time of your choosing, with full provision for your return journey and your continued practice. I do not keep people who do not wish to remain." Rael, beside him, had the expression of a man listening to his very serious king say something he had never heard him say to anyone before. Lottie looked at the moon for a moment. Then she looked back at Caius. "I will consider it," she said. She did not say yes. She had learned tonight the cost of believing in promises made in firelight. But she did not say no either, because she had also learned, tonight, that some things in this world were not what they first appeared, and that a pair of ice-blue eyes in a moonlit courtyard could be, against all reasonable expectation, the most honest thing in a room full of sworn oaths. She pulled her cloak tighter and walked to the gate. She did not look back, but she heard him, just before the gate swung shut behind her. Not words, just the quiet exhale of a man who has been holding something in his chest and has not quite yet decided what to do about it. 6 weeks passed the way 6 weeks pass when a person is trying very hard not to count them. Lottie returned to the healing house the morning after the Feast of the Binding Moon, and did not speak of what had happened in the courtyard to anyone except Maren. Maren, who had been waiting at the door of their shared quarters with a candle, and the expression of someone who has been rehearsing concern for several hours, listened to the full account in silence and then said, with the particular directness of an older sister who has earned the right, "You are going to the Winter Court." "I said I would consider it," Lottie replied. "You are going," Maren repeated, and put the candle down. She was right, of course. Lottie had known it in the courtyard, in the moment she had looked at the moon, and felt something settle in her chest that was not resignation and not hope, but something sturdier than either, a quiet, practical recognition that the door in front of her was real, and that she had spent enough of her life walking past real doors, because they did not look the way she had expected doors to look. She sent her acceptance through a royal courier who appeared at the healing house 4 days after the feast, which told her the king had anticipated her answer. She found she did not mind that. The 6 weeks were spent in preparation. She continued her work at the healing house. There were always fevers to manage, wounds to clean, bones to set after the rougher elements of lower quarter life made their usual demands. She asked the senior curandera, old Hedda, everything she could think of about royal household protocol, court healers, and the structure of service under the crown. Hedda, who had once spent a winter at a lord's estate 3 decades past, told her what she knew, and supplemented the gaps with what she invented, which Lottie learned to distinguish by the way Hedda's left eye narrowed slightly when she was uncertain. She also, in her quieter moments, thought about Caius Draveth. She thought about him the way she thought about difficult cases at the healing house, carefully, without sentiment, turning the observable facts in her hands and examining what they suggested. He had noticed her in a crowded hall. He had followed her into a courtyard. He had spoken plainly, without flattery or performance, about what he had seen and what he thought of it. He had offered her something real, and then waited, without pressing, for her to decide. These were not the behaviors of a man playing a game she recognized. She had known Edmund's games. She knew the language of men who wanted something convenient, and called it devotion, until convenience ended. Caius had not spoken the language of convenience. He had spoken the language of observation, precise, direct, and strangely respectful. She did not know what to do with that yet, so she filed it carefully and returned to her poultices. The Winter Court of Ironvale Castle was a different creature from the Feast of the Binding Moon. Where the feast had been loud and ceremonial and thick with the politics of pack alliance, the Winter Court was quieter, a working court, functional and purposeful, the day-to-day machinery of a kingdom rather than its public face. Lottie arrived with a small travel chest, her healer's satchel, and Maren, who had announced she was accompanying her sister to the castle and would find employment there or manufacture some, and had done exactly that within 24 hours by presenting herself to the head of the kitchens with a list of Lottie's dietary requirements and ending the conversation somehow as an assistant provisioner. Lottie was installed in the castle's healer's wing, a long stone corridor of modest but clean chambers, smelling of dried lavender and wood smoke, populated by a small staff of royal curanderos who received her with professional courtesy and a careful assessment of her skills that she recognized as the polite version of a test. She passed it by correctly identifying 3 unlabeled medicinal compounds by smell alone, which earned her a raised eyebrow from the head curandero, a gray-bearded man named Oswin, and thereafter a level of collegial respect she had not expected to arrive at so quickly. She did not see the king for 11 days. She registered his absence the way she registered a quiet pulse in a patient who should be showing more activity, as a data point, something to note without drawing premature conclusions. The court moved around him in his absence. Advisors, scribes, pack representatives, household staff. She heard his name spoken in corridors the way weather is spoken of, as a force that was currently elsewhere, but whose patterns everyone tracked regardless. On the 12th day, she was in the castle's lower infirmary, treating a guardsman who had taken a training injury to the shoulder when she heard the main doors open. She did not look up immediately. She was mid-wrap on the bandaging, and looking up mid-wrap was how wraps were done incorrectly. Oswin said you identified the 3 compounds. She recognized the voice. She finished the wrap before she turned. Caius stood inside the infirmary door. He had been riding. She could read it in the dust on his boots, and the faint scent of horse and cold air that came in with him. And there was a fresh cut along his right forearm, shallow but unattended, which explained the visit more practically than any other reason she might have constructed. He was wearing the same black leather armor as before, minus the fur manto. His dark braids were slightly disordered from the road. He looked exactly like a man who had not stopped to address a minor wound until someone had made him. Aconitum compound, nightshade tincture, and ironbark resin, she said. Yes. Oswin has been testing new staff with those 3 compounds for 16 years, Caius said. No one has ever identified all 3. Aconitum has a very specific bitterness under the sweetness, she said. Most people smell the sweetness first and stop there. She glanced at his forearm. How long has that been bleeding? He looked at it briefly, as though he had genuinely forgotten. Since this morning. Sit down, she said. He sat. Not with any fuss about it. He simply moved to the low bench along the wall and sat the way he did everything, with the settled assurance of a man entirely at ease in his own body regardless of circumstance. The guardsman she had been treating made a small sound that might have been surprise, and then became very focused on his own shoulder. Lottie cleaned the cut with herb water and examined it properly. It was shallow, as she had thought. No deeper tissue involvement, already clotting well on its own. She applied a drawing compound to prevent corruption, and wrapped it cleanly, working with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not find the proximity of kings particularly destabilizing. She was mostly lying to herself about that last part, but the hand stayed steady, and that was what mattered. You said you do not keep people who do not wish to remain, as she said while she worked. I did. I have been here 12 days and have not been given a reason to leave. She secured the wrap. I wanted to tell you that. He was quiet for a moment. She did not look up from the final knot. That is the most reserved expression of satisfaction I have encountered, he said. I am a careful person, she replied. I was taught that premature conclusions are the primary cause of errors in diagnosis. And in other things, he said. She looked up then. He was watching her with that same direct ice-blue attention. Not pressing, not demanding, simply present in the way that a very still and very powerful thing can be present, which is to say completely. In other things as well, she agreed quietly. He stood, looked at the clean wrap on his forearm, and then looked at her. There is a council session this afternoon that will run until evening. Tomorrow morning I walk the training yard at first light. If you wish to see more of the castle, that corridor off the east tower is usually empty at that hour. It was not an invitation, precisely. It was a piece of information, offered without expectation, which she could choose to use or not. She chose. I will bear that in mind, she said. He nodded once, briefly, and left the infirmary. The door swung shut behind him. The injured guardsman stared at the door for a long moment, and then looked at Lottie with an expression she declined to acknowledge. Rest that shoulder for 4 days, she said. No training. The guardsman nodded, and did not say whatever he had been about to say, which was the wisest decision he had made all week. She was in the East Tower corridor at first light. So was he. They walked for an hour through the quiet upper passages of Ironvale, speaking in the manner of people who are learning each other's conversational weight, carefully, with space between sentences, letting things settle before adding more. He asked about the healing house. She told him about Hedda and her wandering certainties, about the 4 years of learning by lamplight, about what it had meant to work in a profession that cared nothing for pack status, because fever and bone fracture did not ask for credentials before arriving. He listened in the way that some people never learn to listen, without preparing his next sentence while she spoke, without redirecting to his own experience, without the subtle impatience that masquerades as engagement. He simply received what she said, and let it be what it was. In return, she learned small things. That he had ruled Veldrath for 9 years, since his father's death in a border conflict when Caius was 24. That Rael had been his companion since boyhood, a third son of a noble family with no inheritance, and an excess of wit, whom Caius had appointed second not for political balance, but because Rael was the only person in the kingdom who told him the truth without calculation. That the scar on his jaw was from his first year of rule, from a challenge he had not entirely expected, and had won more narrowly than the official account acknowledged. She did not ask about a queen consort. She had heard, in the corridors of the healing wing, the particular quiet that surrounded certain topics. And the king's unmarried status was one of them, not from lack of candidates, Oswin had mentioned obliquely, but from a discernment in the king himself that had so far found nothing worthy of certainty. She filed that carefully too. When they reached the end of the corridor, and the pale winter light through the arrow-slit windows fell across them, he stopped walking and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Something more open than he habitually showed. Something that had been considering itself for some time. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she asked. "I am not certain," he said honestly. "Something less." She held his gaze in the quiet morning light, in the old stone corridor that smelled of cold and centuries, and felt something shift in the carefully ordered architecture of her caution. Not collapse. Nothing so dramatic as that, but a single quiet movement, like a key turning in a lock that had been closed so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "I should return to the infirmary," she said. "Oswin begins rounds early." "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for a breath longer than was strictly necessary. Then she walked back down the corridor, and the winter light followed her the length of the hall, and she did not look back. But this time, unlike the courtyard, it was not because she was protecting herself. It was because she already knew he was watching. Spring came to Ironvale the way it always came to the high country. Reluctantly in pieces, the snow retreating from the southern walls first, while the northern towers stayed gray and cold for weeks longer. Lottie had been at court for 3 months, when the first crocuses pushed through the frozen ground of the castle garden, and she noticed them, because she'd begun taking her morning tea in the garden, when the weather permitted, in the company of Marin, who had expanded her role in the kitchens to something that resembled general domestic authority over a staff of 12, and showed no signs of modesty about it. "He watches you during the evening meal," Marin said, on a morning in early spring, when the air still bit, but the light had softened. "He watches the entire hall during the evening meal," Lottie said. "It is what kings do." "He watches the hall," Marin agreed, wrapping both hands around her clay cup. "And then he watches you. There is a difference, and you know it." Lottie knew it. She had been knowing it with increasing precision for 3 months, cataloging it with the same careful attention she gave to subtle changes in a patient's condition. The kind of changes that individually meant little and collectively meant everything. The morning walks had continued. They were not daily. Caius was a ruling king with the full weight of Veldrath's 7 packs beneath him. And there were weeks when council sessions and border disputes and the unending administration of a kingdom kept him from anything resembling leisure. But when the walks happened, They happened with a consistency and a quality of attention that she had stopped pretending was incidental. They had discussed, over the accumulation of those early mornings, the principles of medicinal herbalism and why most warriors refused to apply them until the wound had already become a problem. The structure of pack allegiance and whether loyalty freely given was more durable than loyalty enforced. The nature of the binding moon ritual and whether Caius believed it actually renewed anything or merely provided an occasion for renewed belief, which was not quite the same thing. He had opinions on all of it, offered without posturing, and he received her responses with the same quality of attention he gave everything, total and unhurried. Rael, who had initially worn the expression of a man watching something he had expected but found surprising anyway, had shifted over the weeks into something warmer and more comfortable. He had taken to stopping by the infirmary with minor complaints of dubious medical necessity, and Lottie had taken to treating them with the straight face of a professional and the awareness that he was, in his indirect way, extending something like friendship. It was Rael who came to find her on the morning everything changed. She was preparing a fever compound when he appeared in the infirmary doorway, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. Not from his expression, which was controlled, but from the particular quality of his stillness, which was nothing like his usual ease. "What is it?" she asked. "The king requires a healer," he said. "Oswin is at the South Garrison treating an outbreak. You are the senior healer present." She was already reaching for her satchel. "What happened?" "He collapsed in the council chamber 20 minutes ago." Rael's voice was flat, with the effort of keeping it flat. "He has been not well for some days. He would not permit anyone to be summoned." Of course he would not. She had suspected something 3 days past, a pallor beneath the dark of his complexion at the evening meal, a tension around his eyes that was not his usual watchfulness but something effortful. And she had filed it carefully and done nothing because he had not asked, and she was a healer, not his physician. Not his. She had not yet found the right word for what she was to him. She followed Rael through the castle at a pace that was almost running. Caius was in his private study when she arrived, the large map-covered room above the great hall that she had passed but never entered, its shelves dense with scrolls and leather-bound records. He was seated in a high-backed chair near the hearth, which told her he had been moved there from wherever he had fallen, and he was upright, which was something. But the upright was maintained with visible effort. He looked at her when she entered. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, but a loosening of the control he was exerting, a fractional allowing of something he had been holding alone. "I told Rael not to summon anyone," he said. Rael disagreed, she said, and came to him. She worked quickly and without theater, the way Hedda had taught her. Hands first, eyes second, conclusions last. His temperature was elevated, significantly. The lymph nodes along his throat were swollen. His eyes, when she checked them, showed the particular brightness of a fever that had been climbing for longer than 3 days. She found, when she pressed carefully along his ribs, a tenderness on the left side that made him go very still. "How long?" she asked. 5 days, he said. "Caius." She used his name without the title, without thinking about it, and he heard it because something changed in his expression, something that had nothing to do with the fever. 5 days. "There were border negotiations," he said, with the air of a man who knows this is not a sufficient answer. "There are always border negotiations," she said. "There is only one of you." She spent an hour working, preparing compounds, adjusting his position near the fire, sending Rael for specific herbs from the infirmary stores, with a list precise enough that Rael left without a single attempt at wit, which told her he was more frightened than he appeared. The massive guard, whose name, she had learned, was Bren, stood inside the door and watched her work with the focused attention of a man assessing a stranger with his king's life in her hands. She did not mind being assessed. She had been assessed her entire life. When she had done what could be done for the immediate crisis, she pulled a stool beside his chair and sat. He was leaning back now, the aggressive uprightness she had arrived to abandon in favor of something more human. "It is not fatal," she said. He looked at her. "I want to say that clearly," she continued, "because you have spent 5 days not summoning a healer, which suggests you were either certain it would pass on its own or entertaining the possibility that it would not, and had decided something about that. I want you to know it will pass, with proper treatment and rest." A long silence. "Rest," he said, with the tone of a man to whom rest is a theoretical concept. 4 days minimum, she said firmly. 7 would be better. The council can function without you for 7 days. The council. Rael can chair the sessions. He is more than capable and will enjoy it enormously, which will be good for him. She met his gaze steadily. 4 days. I will be here. Something moved across his face. Not weakness. She had learned by now to distinguish weakness from the specific vulnerability of a very strong person, allowing themselves to be cared for, which was not weakness at all, but a different kind of strength, harder in some ways, requiring the setting down of something heavy. "You said you are a careful person," he said quietly. "I did." "You have been careful for 3 months," he said. "With everything." She looked at him in the firelight, at the familiar lines of his face, the strong jaw, the scar, the ice-blue eyes that were slightly dimmed now with fever, but no less direct, no less entirely present in that particular way he had of being present, as though the thing in front of him was the only thing in the world. "Some things," she said carefully, "are worth being careful with." His hand, resting on the arm of the chair, moved slightly. Not much, just the extension of his fingers toward the edge, which was almost nothing and completely everything. She placed her hand over his. Neither of them spoke. The fire settled in the hearth. Bren maintained his post at the door with the absolute professionalism of a man who had decided he was not witnessing anything. After a long moment, Caius turned his hand beneath hers, so their fingers were properly joined, with the deliberateness of a man who does nothing by accident. 4 days, he said. 4 days, she confirmed. He was a terrible patient for approximately 1 day, and then, gradually, became a better one. She suspected, because being a poor patient required an energy expenditure he no longer had, and because she was relentlessly, pleasantly immovable on every medical point, which he appeared to find more settling than aggravating. On the 2nd day of his recovery, Edmund Ashfin arrived at Ironvale Castle. She learned it from Marin, who had learned it from the gate records, which Marin now had access to by virtue of provisioning responsibilities that had somehow expanded to include coordinating supply deliveries with the outer gatehouse. Edmund had come as part of a small Ashfin delegation, she said. Pack business, a routine territorial matter, and had not known Lottie was at court until he arrived, and a guardsman mentioned, in passing, that the healer currently tending the king had come from the lower quarter healing house. Marin had watched his face when he heard that, she reported. It had done something interesting. Lottie absorbed this, and returned to the medicinal notes she had been compiling on the king's recovery. She was in the corridor outside the study that afternoon, speaking with Rael about the evening's fever management, when Edmund found her. He looked the same. That was the first thing she noticed. He looked entirely the same, handsome and broad-shouldered and wearing the Ashfin colors with the ease of a man secure in his belonging. Lady Seraphine's name, she had heard in the weeks after the feast, was already being spoken alongside his as a certainty. He stopped when he saw her. She watched the calculation move through his expression. Not cruelty. Edmund had never been cruel, only convenient. And then something she had not expected. A genuine discomfort. The specific shade of it that came not from guilt, exactly, but from the unwelcome confrontation with a previous version of oneself. Lottie, he said. Edmund? She replied pleasantly. His eyes moved over her. The clean healer's apron over a well-made dress, the quiet confidence of her posture, the absence of the particular tension she had always carried in his presence, and had not, until this moment of its absence, noticed she had been carrying. His gaze moved to Rael, who was standing beside her with the expression of someone cataloging information for future use. "You are here," Edmund said. "At court." "I am the senior healer in attendance on the king," she said simply. The specific quality of silence that followed was the silence of a man recalculating several past decisions simultaneously. Rael beside her said nothing. He did not need to. His presence beside her said everything a crown representative's presence could say, which was considerable. "I am glad you are well," Edmund said at last. He meant it, she thought. It was the most genuine thing he had said to her in months, and it had arrived far too late to mean anything except what it was. The recognition, finally arrived, of something he had not understood until he could no longer have it. "I am very well," she said. "I hope the Ashfin delegation finds its business here concluded to satisfaction." "Aye." She turned back to Rael and continued the conversation about fever management as though the interruption had been a minor one, which, she realized as she heard Edmund's footsteps retreat down the corridor, was precisely what it had been. Rael waited until the footsteps were gone before he said with quiet appreciation, "That was exceptionally well done." "I was simply being accurate," she said. "Yes," Rael agreed and smiled. "You usually are." Caius was on his feet by the 5th day, which was 1 day earlier than she had prescribed, and 2 days earlier than she had privately expected, because she had by then developed an accurate model of his relationship with physical limitation, which was that he acknowledged it precisely long enough to defeat it, and then moved on. She made her displeasure at the early recovery known with clinical precision, and he listened to every word of it with the focused attention he gave all things, and then stood up anyway. She decided this was, on balance, a good sign. The 7th day of what had been officially recorded in the castle, records as the king's period of private council. Rael's wording, which she appreciated for its diplomatic tidiness. Caius asked her to walk with him. Not the early morning corridor. The castle's outer ramparts, where the spring air had finally committed to warmth, and the hills beyond Ironvale's walls were going green in long, slow waves down to the river. They walked side by side along the stone parapet, the kingdom spread below them, and for a while neither of them spoke, which had become one of the things she valued most about his company. That silence between them had weight and texture, and was not empty, was not the silence of people who had run out of things to say, but of people who had enough between them that silence could hold it comfortably. "There is something I have not told you," he said. She waited. "When I came to the Feast of the Binding Moon," he said, "I was not planning to attend. I had sent word that my second would represent the crown." He paused. "Something changed my mind that morning. I could not have told you what it was. A restlessness. A sense of something unfinished. I have learned over years to follow that sense." She looked at the hills. And I walked into that hall, and within 4 minutes the only thing I was certain of was that there was a woman near the east arch in a green dress who smelled of meadowsweet and ironbark, and something else I had no name for, and that she was trying very hard not to show that she was in pain. The meadowsweet was from the Healing House Gardens. She grew it herself, used it in half her compounds, had been surrounded by it so long she no longer noticed it on herself. The ironbark resin. She had handled it the morning of the feast, preparing a salve for an elderly patient's joint pain. "You knew all of that from across a hall," she said. "A wolf knows what a wolf knows," he said quietly. "I did not understand what it meant. I only knew I needed to follow you into that courtyard." She turned to look at him. He was watching the hills with the particular expression he wore when he was saying something that cost him something, not difficult in the sense of painful, but difficult in the sense of rare, of not frequently offered. "Caius," she said. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something as well," she said. "I came to this court carefully. I came prepared to be grateful and professional, and to give nothing more than the work I was here to do. because I had recently been reminded that believing in things before they were certain was a reliable path to standing alone in a green dress in a crowded hall. His jaw tightened slightly. She pressed on. And then I was here, and you were what you are, which is to say exactly what you appear to be, which I had not previously encountered in a person of any significant authority, and which took me some time to believe was real and not a more sophisticated version of something I had seen before. She held his gaze. I believe it now. He was very still. I am Packless, she said. I have no family alliance, no political value, no bloodline that anyone has thought worth recording. I am a curandera from the lower quarter who can identify 3 compounds by smell and makes very good fever tisane. I need you to understand that I know precisely what I am and what I am not, before anything further is said between us. I know what you are, he said. His voice had dropped to something quieter and more direct than she had heard from him before. I have known since the courtyard. I told you your scent was not unremarkable. I was being restrained. He paused. You carry the bloodline marker of the old Veldrath line, the founding pack. It has been absent from the known records for 2 generations. She stared at him. Oswin confirmed it, Caius said, when I asked him to assess your compound's identification. Iron bark recognition at that sensitivity is not learned. It is inherited. Your father's line, or your mother's, carried it dormant. In you it is not dormant. The founding pack of Veldrath, the line that had existed before the 7 packs, before the hierarchy, before any of it. She thought of her father, the herbalist, who had died packless and unremarkable and had never explained why. She thought of the way Oswin had raised his eyebrow when she identified the 3 compounds. She thought of Caius, in the courtyard, saying your scent is not unremarkable with the flatness of someone stating a fact so significant he had chosen to understate it entirely. You knew this, she said slowly. From the beginning. I suspected it, he said. I was certain by the end of your first week here. And you said nothing. You needed to be here as yourself, he said simply. Not as a bloodline, not as a political discovery. You needed to come to this court and learn it, and be known in it as what you are. A healer of exceptional skill who walks with integrity and treats kings like inconvenient patients when they deserve it. The faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. The bloodline explains what I scented in that hall. It does not explain anything else. She absorbed this for a long moment, looking out over the hills, over the green kingdom that rolled away from Ironvale's walls in every direction, over the river that caught the spring light and threw it back silver. What are you asking me? She said at last. I am not asking, he said. I am telling you what is true, and then I am offering you a choice with no guarantee of outcome, because that is the only kind of choice I know how to offer. He turned to face her fully, and in the clear spring light she could see every line of him. The scar, the ice-blue eyes, the absolute steadiness of a man who had decided something and was stating it without ornamentation. I want you to remain, not as a healer in my household, though you are the finest one I have encountered. Not because of the bloodline, though it matters to Veldrath's history. I want you to remain because every room I enter that you are in is different from every room I enter that you are not. And I am 41 years old, and have been king for 17, and I have not said that to anyone before, and do not expect I will say it to anyone after. The wind moved between them. Below, the training yard was beginning to fill with the morning's first sparring sessions, the distant sound of wooden training swords carried up on the air. Lottie thought about the healing house and the silver thread Wolf and Marin crying over a dress. She thought about a courtyard and a moon, and a man who had told her the truth when he could have offered her flattery. She thought about 4 days of fever tea, and her hand over his, and the deliberate, unambiguous way he had turned his hand beneath hers. She thought about what it meant to be certain. I will remain, she said. He let out a slow breath, that same exhale she had heard behind her at the gate on the night of the feast, the sound of something held carefully for a long time being allowed to rest. He reached out and took her hand, properly this time, in the full light of morning on the open rampart, where anyone in the castle yard below could see, which she understood was not incidental. They were joined before the pack representatives of all 7 clans at the next binding moon, 6 months later, in the great hall of Ironvale Castle, the same hall where, 1 year prior, a woman in a green wool dress had stood alone near the east arch and tried not to show that she was in pain. Rael stood at Caius's right and wept with the composed devastation of a man who had been telling himself for months that he was not going to do that. Maren stood at Lottie's left and did not weep at all, because she had known this was coming since the night she had put a candle down and said, "You are going," and she had used the intervening year to be thoroughly right about it and felt no need for additional emphasis. Oswin, in the front row of the assembly, nodded once when the binding words were spoken, with the expression of a man whose suspicions had been confirmed in the most satisfactory possible way. Bren at the door remained at his post and allowed himself the smallest of smiles, which was, for Bren, equivalent to open celebration. Edmund Ashfen was not present. He had concluded his territorial business at Ironvale 3 months prior and returned to his pack, where Lady Seraphine was now his bonded mate, and by all accounts, the arrangement suited both families precisely as designed. Lottie had heard this from a courier's passing report and had noted it and moved on, because there was nothing in it that required her attention, and a great deal in her present life that did. In the years that followed, Ironvale's healing house, expanded under Lottie's direction into a proper wing with trained staff drawn from every quarter of the city, pack and packless alike, became known across the 7 territories as the finest center of healing knowledge in the kingdom. She continued to practice personally because she had not become queen in order to stop being a curandera, a position she made clear in her first address to the household staff and never revisited because it required no revisiting. Caius governed Veldrath as he had always governed it, with the careful attention of a man who understood that power was a thing to be used precisely and not carelessly, and the addition of a queen who had grown up packless and knew every part of the kingdom's lower life, with the intimacy of someone who had lived it, brought a quality of governance to the decisions that hadn't been there before. He consulted her. He listened. He changed his conclusions when her reasoning warranted it, which it frequently did. Rael served as second for another decade before finally accepting a lordship in the Northern Territories, a decision he announced with elaborate reluctance and executed with obvious delight. He visited Ironvale 4 times a year and spent the visits arguing with Maren, who had become head of the castle's domestic provisioning and had opinions about everything, and finding the arguments so stimulating that the visits grew longer each time until they simply overlapped and he stayed. No one commented on this arrangement. It did not require comment. Bren remained at his post. On a morning in the 2nd year of their bonding, Lottie stood on the east rampart at first light, the same rampart, the same direction, and looked out over the hills. The kingdom was going gold with autumn, the river catching early sun, the training yard quiet below. Behind her she heard the door, and then the familiar weight of a presence beside her, the particular warmth of him. Caius stood with her and looked at the hills. "You are thinking," he said. "I am often thinking," she replied. "You are thinking about something specific," he said, which was accurate in the way his observations always were, arriving without drama at the center of things. She turned and looked at him in the morning light. The braids, the scar, the ice-blue eyes that were entirely warm in a way that the rest of his face had learned, gradually and then irrevocably, to reflect. "I was thinking," she said, "about a woman in a green dress who almost walked out of a gate and kept walking." She paused. "And about what she would have missed." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he lifted his hand and tucked a loose strand of her blonde hair back from her face, the braid long since undone in the way of a bonded mate, her hair worn loose now as a different kind of statement, and left his hand against her cheek. "Everything," he said quietly. She would have missed everything. She leaned into his hand and the autumn light came up over the hills of Veldrath, and the kingdom went gold around them, and the story that had begun in humiliation and ended in something so sturdy and true, it needed no further proof of itself settled into its final shape, not with triumph, not with ceremony, but with two people standing on a stone rampart in the early light, hand to cheek, watching the same hills, certain of each other in the complete and quiet way that only comes when something has been chosen. Again and again, with full knowledge of the cost and no regret for the price, the gate Lottie had almost walked through for the last time stood below, as it always had. She had not needed to walk through it. She had simply needed to turn around.